Join us at Glossy's Beauty and Wellness Summit from November 11th through 13th in Napa, California. Influential beauty and wellness leaders will meet to discuss strategies and pain points, discover innovative tech, and ultimately make valuable business connections through one-on-ones and casual networking. For a limited time, we're offering $200 off with promo code GBS24, no spaces. Again, that's GBS24 with no spaces. Go to glossy.co/beauty summit for more information and to secure your pass today.
Hello, and welcome back to the Glossy Week in Review podcast. I'm your host, senior fashion reporter Danny Parisi, and I'm here with our international reporter, Zofia Zviglinska. How's it going, Zofia?
Yeah, good, thank you. Thank you so much for having me on again.
Of course, thanks for being here. This week, we've got sort of a luxury-focused episode. First, we're going to talk about new executive leadership at Gucci and what's been going on there. We'll talk about Frasers Group and their bid to take over Mulberry. And actually, a couple of Mulberry-related news stories have happened in the last 2 weeks. So we'll talk about that. And then finally, we're going to talk about this new joint venture between Authentic Brands Group and Saks Fifth Avenue, or Saks Global, the parent company, I should say, which is called Authentic Luxury Group. So a very luxury-heavy episode today. Let's start with Gucci. So announced this week, Stefano Cantino is taking over as the new CEO of Kering's biggest brand, Gucci. He's taking over from Jean-Francois Palus, I think is how you say his name, or Palou. But it's the latest in sort of an ongoing transition that's been happening at Gucci. Obviously, Sabato de Sarno took over from Alessandro Michele. I think that was in 2022. But then also Marco Bizzarri, who was the CEO of Gucci, left after that. And then he was replaced by Palus, who is now replaced by Cantino. I feel like they're in the middle of sort of a transition period for sure. And I think part of that is just that Gucci, like a lot of luxury brands, has sort of been struggling. They're Kering's biggest brand. They're like 30% of Kering's revenue or something. But their sales have been struggling, again, like a lot of luxury brands. So it's not just them. What do you make of the seemingly rapid shifting of leadership at Gucci? I think that Palus was sort of meant to be an interim CEO in the first place, so I don't think it's like super shocking that they're replacing him. But I don't know. What do you make of the situation there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the changes that have happened at Gucci are kind of like, it's been happening for quite some time. And obviously with Cantino, I feel like it's almost like two different types of like brand people. Like Cantino's a massive like marketer. Like he's, had kind of a bit more of a focus on like marketing at Prada. Like there's been, some of his previous experience is more around brand building and like image building, essentially. And the previous CEO was all about kind of financials. And obviously Gucci did have a pretty bad period. The sales were down, but it seemed like that wasn't enough to kind of boost the brand, just controlling those finances. So I'm wondering now if there's going to be a bit of like a brand reinvention. They've been talking about quiet luxury, which I don't know if Gucci's ever been quiet luxury to me.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of the opposite of, Alessandro Michele might be the spokesperson for loud luxury. I feel like his style was famously and successfully maximalist, even at a time when Bottega and Loro Piana were all like kind of doing well with quiet luxury. I feel like the Michele style still was doing well. So yeah, definitely interesting shift if that's where they end up going.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that like that kind of maximalism really worked well for them when customers were looking for, pieces that were kind of more loud. But it does feel like a lot of the brands that have had success with quiet luxury have had almost like consistent success. It's not something that's kind of just lasted, as a one-off trend. It seems to be driving a lot of like their sales quarter over quarter. I mean, if you look at, some of the kind of I guess like ultimate quiet luxury brands, something like Loro Piana, that seems to be doing really well for them. And I guess with Kering, with Gucci being their biggest brand, I think they need almost like a Hail Mary for the brand to kind of go back to being as big as it once was. And I just don't know if that's really possible, but we'll see.
Yeah, to be specific with the numbers around Gucci, their first half revenue this year fell 20%. It's down to 4.5 billion, which is still, humongous dollars. But still, it's a pretty big drop off from them. Yeah, I think you're right about the Hail Mary element of it, because Gucci is such a big part of Kering's business, that is a brand that they can't mess around with. It needs to be successful. And Michele and his era was very successful for them, but also kind of volatile and risky. And maybe it's safer for your core bedrock brand to be a like kind of safer, consistent look that's not changing all the time, and that leans into the long heritage and everything. I've seen some of the way that Kering and Gucci leadership have talked about the brand as wanting to lean into the fact that it's a brand that's been around for a long time and has a history and everything. And it's like, if you're going to build, a large portfolio of brands around one core brand that's making up a big chunk of revenue, it's probably good for that brand to be a little bit safer with their designs and with their creative, But at the same time, I think we've definitely talked about this on the podcast. Luxury fashion, I think, is one of the few industries where being daring and bold and is like what the most successful brands do. I mean, like,
yeah, just look at
obviously
LV.
like like in any sector, like being innovative is obviously good, but I think fashion is, because it's in the business of trend setting as opposed to trend following, it is good for them to not look like everyone else, to not do what everyone else is doing. There's some risk in that. If people don't take to it, then you've spent a bunch of money on a direction that doesn't go anywhere. But that's a risk in any business, and I think it pays off really well in fashion to set trends and have everybody try to look like you. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. I think that I'm still not convinced about Sabate's kind of direction at Gucci. Like, I feel like the shows haven't really been as, I guess, like as emblematic or as big as, something like the Tom Ford Gucci or, as you said, like Alessandro's. I feel like there's more that can be done with the brand, considering like its legacy and everything else.
Yeah. One more thing about Gucci is that Contino is a very different type of executive. I mean, you mentioned this too, Pelouse, but one thing is that Jean-Francois Pelouse is just like a guy who's friends with Francois-Henri Pinault, who is the owner of Kering. And I think there was some feeling that he's not super experienced at running a brand like Gucci, whereas Contino, as you could not be more qualified. Like, he was an executive at Louis Vuitton for a while. He worked at Prada. Like, he's got the sort of classical experience with like leading a traditional European luxury house. And it was making me think of the conversations we've had recently about, specifically Michael Ryder taking over at Celine. For a while, people were sort of concerned about, does real experience matter or just like star power, with Pharrell at Louis Vuitton, who there's, different opinions on this. Like, I think he is very, skilled and experienced, but there was definitely a sense of like, why go to Central St. Martin's or whatever if you're just going to like some celebrity's going to get the job in place of you or something like that. Contino definitely is like someone who has the classical experience needed for the role. Maybe that will give some confidence to the investors. Hopefully it'll lead to some operational successes for them. But I just thought that was notable given what we've talked about.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that a lot of the times, especially when you look at the industry, like there's a lot of people who are, like purely marketers or purely like creative directors or else celebrities like with Pharrell. But I think that a lot of the times you end up falling back on those people who've been through, the kind of ups and downs of companies, not just over like, a 5-year period or a 10-year period, but someone who's been around for much longer and who can see these things through, who has maybe a longer term direction for the brand as well. Because that was something with, Gucci and the creative director changes that's happened. I think that maybe that longer term direction isn't quite as defined as it should be. So I'm wondering if that's something that Contino can also bring to the brand.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of luxury brands who are struggling with lowered sales, our second topic, I want to talk about Mulberry, British luxury handbag brand. A little bit hard for me to tell over here in the States, Zofia, but how much of a household name is Mulberry? Is it like a brand everybody knows? Like, it's always felt a little small to me compared to the other British luxury brand with Berry in the name, Burberry. Is Mulberry like, what's the perception in the UK?
Yeah, so Mulberry has dropped off. Let's do a little quick timeline kind of loop just to catch people up in the States, but Mulberry was founded by Roger Saul, who's still connected to the company in Somerset, which is this like rolling countryside part of the UK, starting as like a small brand producing bags and accessories from his kitchen table. And then it went on from 1971 to 1996, going public on the London Stock Exchange. And this is kind of where it really like it came alive. Let's just say it launched the Alexa handbag inspired by Alexa Chung in 2010. And that was kind of when it started like really going. It had sales and valuations of 1.5 billion at one point in 2012. And I think a lot of the times those creative directors, talking about all of that, were a bit emblematic to making Mulberry such a household name. You had designer Emma Hill, who was credited with the success of the Alexa bag. And, I think you see Alexa Chung kind of coming back with Barbour collections and Madewell collections this year. So it's someone who has been around for a long time in fashion, and she's very connected to those British brands. I think she's done stuff with, Barbour over Burberry, but definitely still a very British connection. In 2015, they had Thierry Andretta, who was formerly of LVMH and Gucci, who was a CEO, but that's where like the challenges kind of started to come up. And this is also where Mike Ashley, who's like this massive tycoon in the UK, owns Frasers Group, owns Sports Direct, which is like a massive like sports company here. He's really well known for these massive mugs that you have, like they're huge. And then he acquires a 12.5% stake in Mulberry in 2020. And then over time, he's increased that stake to 37%. I think maybe it might be even more by now. And this is obviously in 2020 when the pandemic hits. And Mulberry really suffered because of the tourist tax, which, has affected Burberry as well and other British brands. A lot of their valuations or even their sales have gone down significantly because shoppers are choosing to go elsewhere rather than being, in London or in the UK. And then now this is the kind of interesting part is like Mulberry has been approached by Mike Ashley and his son-in-law, Michael Murray, who kind of leads Frasers, about being more involved in Mulberry leadership and decision-making. And that happened in 2022. And I think there's been some movement since then, but I'm sure you've caught up on that.
Yeah, so I think Frasers Group still owns 37% of Mulberry. And then the news, there's multiple kind of bits of news around this brand to talk about. But last week, Frasers Group launched a bid to kind of just take over Mulberry entirely. Their reasoning was that Mulberry's like, obviously their sales have been down. And last month they announced a plan to raise around, I think it's around $12 million in US dollars to boost finances. And Fraser said that they only heard about that like, the moment before the announcement was made.
Yeah.
And they're concerned about the long-term health of Mulberry. And so they offered, I think it's like $103 million, I think, to buy up the rest of the stakes and just take over Mulberry completely. And then the second bit of news is that Mulberry then rejected that offer. They consulted with the other big shareholder in the brand, which is the Singaporean company Chalice, which I think owns more than 50% of Mulberry, and rejected the offer. They basically said that $103 million was too low, especially that they had a turnaround plan in place. They're raising $12 million in finances. They just appointed a new CEO, Andrea Baldo, who I think came from Ghani before this, and he just took over in July. So it's now there's like kind of this public kind of back and forth between these two companies. Frasers doesn't seem very confident that the leadership of Mulberry can do this turnaround plan that they have in mind. And then the Mulberry leadership is like, we're not going to sell for like what does seem like kind of a small, like a low price for a big luxury, British luxury house that's been around for a while. So what's your take on that kind of back and forth? Do you think either side here has a better claim to leading the brand?
Well, I mean, I would say Frasers are in a slightly better position because of the fact that the leader of the Chalice Group, I think the head of the Ong family, has just been either indicted or like he's criminally being prosecuted.
I think
arrested, yeah, for accepting bribes.
Giving bribes.
There you go. So I think that that's something that, is going to be putting him at a serious disadvantage, considering, I guess, like the position of the brand and the fact that it hasn't been making as much money as it should be. I think that, Frasers has been successful in some ways. I would say that a lot of people have opinions about how well it's doing and whether, with all of the different kind of things that are happening with luxury retailers that Ashley has been involved with, let's say like things like Browns, all of that is kind of indicative that I'm not sure he's really able to put forward a proper luxury brand and control it in such a way where, you'd actually have success year over year as, a purely kind of British vehicle. But at the same time, Mulberry's had a real issue with, I think, identifying brand direction over the last couple of years. It hasn't gone from strength to strength in terms of securing like what its identifiable kind of thing is. And I think that with all of these brands, especially from the US, kind of focusing on accessible luxury, Mulberry's kind of had to like pivot, and it hasn't really done that. I think it needed to like adjust to the new competitive space, especially, from brands like Coach, but also, Metier, brands which have either captured smaller parts of the luxury market or much bigger parts of that kind of accessible luxury market. I feel like it's had a bit of a tough time finding its identity. On the other hand, it did a pretty successful collaboration last month with the UK designer Regina Pio, and I think that was something that is probably a little bit of Baldo's influence from Ganni. Pio is a very cool brand. They did a very fun activation in Korea. I think maybe putting a little bit of that international element in there might help it revive, although I don't know what the next moves will be, so we'll see about that.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you said, and a little more about Ong Beng Seng, who is the Singaporean businessman who owns Chalice, which in turn owns a big stake of Mulberry. Yeah, so he was, I believe, arrested this week in connection to, there's a Singaporean minister who was arrested last year. S. Iswaran is his name, who was arrested for corruption charges, and he was just convicted and got his prison term this week. And then right after that, Ong Beng Seng got arrested because he was the one who was bribing this minister and giving him tickets to UK soccer matches, tickets to Formula One races, tickets to musicals in London, flights on private jet, stuff like that. So it's a little bit removed from the Mulberry situation, but I mean, if it affects him, it affects his finances, which affects Chalice's finances, which affects its ability to run part of Mulberry. So they may now be more interested in taking $103 million from Fraser's Group if they need it for legal fees and stuff like that. So I definitely think that is a new factor in this back and forth between Mulberry and Fraser. So I don't know. We'll see how that plays out. Let's talk about our final topic, though, which is Authentic Luxury Group. Authentic Brands Group, who we've talked about a bunch and written quite a bit about, just because they have bought up an absurd number of fashion brands in the past few years. They have a new venture, a joint venture, building off some of their luxury acquisitions. They formed this joint venture with Saks Global called Authentic Luxury Group that will manage and sort of incubate their luxury and luxury adjacent brands like Barney's and Hervé Leger and also Vince. It's a little bit vague exactly what that means, but basically they were it's going to incubate and accelerate the growth of the luxury properties that they have. What do you make of that strategy? I feel I'm a little skeptical of it for a number of reasons, but I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I think I join you in skepticism. For me, an incubator is a vehicle that you use to help, young, interesting brands grow. The kind of assortment of brands that, this group has, I would say that none of them are particularly new. They're all kind of established brands, and they're brands that haven't had as much success in a turnaround, perhaps. So I wouldn't say this is as much an incubator as it is almost like a prop up to help kind of boost these brands in an international market. I think that the idea is that there's going to be strategic licensing agreements and distribution channels. So the idea is to kind of expand it in other fields where those brands may not be as big in presence, but doing it in a way which is kind of more economical because it's happening through this group. So, licensing, distribution in Europe, Asia, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. The thing that stands out to me is that a lot of the brands that they mention are not the most luxurious of brands, like Vince. Vince is a good brand and so is Hervé Leger and stuff, but they're not luxury in the way that I would think of it. Barney's is maybe the best, although that's more of a luxury retailer. They said that Barney's is going to be like the first brand to sort of, I think they used the term positioned for accelerated growth. They specifically talked about doing like lifestyle stuff beyond fashion as a growth area, like the Barney's residences in Tulum, stuff like that. I don't know. Luxury is like so competitive. And then as we've been talking about, it's kind of in a valley right now. It's at a low point. A lot of luxury brands, even extremely established ones like Gucci, are struggling. So I don't know if just like having a new joint venture and incubating Barney's is, I just like not sure how well that's going to work for them.
Yeah. I agree. And you have to like think about the death of the pop-up as well, which is something that like a lot of people have been talking about this week. Like the main vehicle that Barney's is planning on making this kind of comeback is through pop-ups and stores in like places like South Korea and China, focusing more on kind of lifestyle product, which I feel like, again, is a massively like competitive and oversaturated place. And I think it's not something where Barney's will make significant enough of an impact that having like a pop-up store will be interesting, especially for like younger customers, which I'm sure will be thinking about the brand as like, oh, this is something that was really cool like 10, 15 years ago. Like, I wonder what it's up to now.
Yeah. One more thing about this is that Saks' role in this is a little unclear to me. Authentic mentioned in the press release that Saks' retail fleet and store positioning is an asset to the joint venture. So presumably these brands are going to be pushed in Saks stores. The question I have around Saks is, are they going to pay the brands? Because I wrote a story a couple of weeks ago about how Saks just doesn't pay people. And it really resonated, I think, with a lot of our readers and Glossy fans, a lot of whom probably sell at Saks and maybe also haven't been paid. And since then, I've continued to hear from people that it's like they still do it. They still will take your product and sell it and then just not pay you unless you like send a collections agency after them or like make legal threats, and then finally they'll pay you, which I truly think, based on the conversations I've had, is like turning a lot of brands off from working with Saks. Like, why would you want to work with someone who's doing that? It's like multiple people have said verbatim that like it's ridiculous and it makes us not want to work with them. So if I were a big holding group with a bunch of brands and I really wanted to accelerate my luxury brand positioning, I don't know if Saks is like the company that I would partner with, because I think they're rapidly losing goodwill with a lot of brands. I think some of their bigger brands they're paying, but I know a lot of smaller brands are waiting around for a check from Saks and it's not coming. So every time we talk about Saks or write about Saks, I feel like we have to mention that because it's just so insane to me.
Yeah, of course. And I think that it's interesting that they're targeting such an international expansion. I'm wondering that's because of the fact that like the local market is already, either it knows this and doesn't want to work with, with Saks on such a scale, or it's, a way to just get in front of new customers. Like, I think the total kind of number of like stores and things is like 3,500, 1,500. It's like almost 15,000 different kind of store and shop-in-shop locations, stores, like all kinds of things. I don't know if like that presence is really needed, especially with, so many brands having much better and closer relationships with like specialist retailers in very specific markets. So yeah, I mean, I feel like that news and, to be honest, like that whole kind of relationship between, brands and Saks is maybe going to taint this a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. I think that's all the time we have this week, but this was a great, fun, luxury-focused conversation. So it was nice to talk about these stories with you. Thank you, as always, Zofia, for being here.
Thank you so much. It was so fun.
For those of you listening, don't forget to give us a rating and a review, whether that's on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, whatever platform you use to listen to this, because that helps us out so much. And don't forget to subscribe to the Glossy Podcast, because you'll hear interviews with industry insiders every Wednesday, and you'll hear Week in Review episodes with me every Friday. Until next time, thank you all for listening.